So let's take a look at what happens if you decide to put the biggest, scariest, and most points intensive units from your codex on the battlefield, with a look at one mega unit from every 40k army book, and roughly how strong these units might be in game. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking about some of the biggest and scariest Warhammer 40k units around. For this one I thought we'd go through the actual Warhammer 40k codexes, see which unit in each of them is the single most points intensive, so if you decided to take a very simple approach to army list building and fill the single unit that costs the most points in your army. For this one I'm going to keep it in codex, so we're not just listing out Forge World Titans for every single faction that has one. I have done some videos in the past that I'll link below if you'd like to check them out. For most of those, nothing has really changed too much. When building mega units for each army, I've decided that I will include named characters alongside their retinues. I say something like Abaddon the Despoiler plus 10 Chaos Terminators all put together to make one absolutely enormous unit. But for this one I'm not going to include either enhancements or transport vehicles. Enhancements will vary depending on detachment and might just be a bit arbitrary if they don't really make any sense to put into that unit, and transport vehicles kind of operate as their own thing, even if they obviously do have synergy with the things they're transporting forwards. I don't think it'd really add too much to the video either, besides piling loads of things into Land Raiders. Let's jump in though, talk through each army and their mega unit, whether it's a character and retinue or one great big super heavy or something. Talk about what they can do on the tabletop and how strong I rate them in game for that combo, and whether the unit might do a little better in certain detachments or if you just tweaks the formula a little bit. Jumping in though, let's start with the Space Marines, and for your starters, as best I could tell, the biggest and most points intensive unit that you can field in Codex is a great big Terminator Assault Squad starting out at 360 points, and then led by Daemon's Lysander of the Imperial Fist with a Terminator Ancient attached, or very topical in terms of new miniatures this year I suppose. That's all clocked in at 525 points. Technically you could have had pricier squads with generic characters and enhancements I suppose, and if you counted Forge World it'd be the Thunderhawk gunship. I guess we do know that Marnius Calgar's coming out fairly shortly and he's going to be in Terminator armour, so if he does wind up costing a little more than Lysander, then that might turn into the biggest cost for the Space Marines. The total Terminators are 360 points when fielded in a 10-man squad. I'd go for the Thunderhammers and Storm Shields for some pretty solid defense with their 4 wounds and their 2+ saves and 4+ invulnerables. With Thunderhammers and that many Marines, you should be able to ruin just about the majority of enemy threats that you come into contact with, particularly with Lysander's damage profile, and throwing in any damage dealer stratagems like Oath of Moment. If you've got an advanced and charged detachment, you could potentially foot slog them up the board, or use rapid ingress with their deep strike to get them into their prey. They're led by Daemon's Lysander, who's 100 points. He got a slightly tweaked datasheet with +1 wound for his extra model, but he still delivers some big blows with a Fist of Dawn at strength 10 and damage 3, and he made that Terminator Assault Squad into a pretty immovable object. -1 to wound is excellent for them, particularly with that tanky defensive profile and affecting so many models. Then finally we've got the Terminator Ancient. He's a fairly common leader for bigger Terminator squads for different factions, and can be quite nice for varying enhancements that you could throw into this. +1 objective control is actually pretty handy for a squad that's quite likely to survive in the midboard while fighting with the enemy, and there's a pretty reasonable chance that they won't be dying in any one turn, so his damage buff effects of +1 to hit and maybe +1 to wound could easily come into effect to aid the unit. Overall, for slightly big dumb super combos of units, I feel like this one maybe isn't the worst in the world. It does feel like an overinvestment, but one that's absolutely going to dominate one area of the board. It will take many foes at least a fair amount of effort to chew through that many Terminators with 4 wounds and a -1 to wound. Still likely not exactly optimal for the Space Marines. I've given them a 6 out of 10 overall for in-game power. It still feels like the Assault Terminators are a bit pricey for what they really bring to the table per the points, and the same for the regular Astartes Terminators. It'd certainly be a bit of a power trip unit to use though. For the Astra Militarum, the answer seems to be a fair bit more straightforward with the Storm Sword, a great big super heavy Baneblade chassis tank armed with the Storm Sword Siege Cannon. It dropped down in cost a little bit in Games Workshop's latest updates, though still remains just a tiny bit pricier than a few of the other variants. In game, for your princely 465 point cost, you get 24 wounds at toughness 13 with a 2+ save. Maybe not hugely excelling versus its weight in Russes or Dawns, but it is particularly tough against certain common anti-tank profiles like las cannons. For its firepower, its main one is the enormous Storm Sword Siege Cannon, d6 + 6 shots at strength 16, AP -4 and damage d6 + 2, with blast and ignores cover. That's going to be utterly ruinous for the vast majority of heavy targets that it might be able to get line of sight on, and could easily be hitting on a 3+ if you can spare a Lord Solar order. Beyond that, the rest of the tank has 4 las cannons, and potentially 5 twin-linked heavy bolter pairs. It's going to have quite a lot of incidental fire to put lots of saves on another unit that it can see, and the big siege cannon might be able to hand out a few more mortal wounds with its special rule. Overall, again, it's not exactly very optimal for the guard, though not unusable, particularly given a 30-point decrease recently. I've given it a 5.5 out of 10, likely best bets to go with the Hammer of the Emperor to allow it to go through some ruin walls for a stratagem when it needs to. Support with Lord Solar for orders, even if it is a bit more of an investment. It's likely to be one of the ones that does better in more casual games with less terrain on the table versus more competitive games where it doesn't really have quite so much room to manoeuvre. You're still probably likely to get more value out of Dawn's and Lehman Ross's point for point though. Before we move on to the rest of the Imperium's other big super units, I'll just give a quick shout out to today's video sponsor in Lighter Creative's battle mats and terrain sets. Both of them are rated relatively reasonably priced to set up a 40k gaming table. They currently ship to the USA, UK and Canada. For their terrain set, it's this Ashfall Citadel one, 4 big ruins, 6 small ones and 4 armoured containers. I've built one of these up myself and I was pretty impressed with the quality of it. It's basically MDF terrain that doesn't actually need any glue to go together and comes pre-painted as well, as I did enjoy how low effort it was to get together an entire table worth of 40k terrain that isn't just bare wood. Here's what it looks like on the board. The ruins are the right sizes for certain competitive formats. Otherwise, they've got their battle mats. These were $80 or £62 last time I looked. They have a light grid layout and the 40k deployment maps, all pre-measured to help set up a game. For their designs, they have the more standard brown one, a sort of city and desert one, a slightly more fantasy focused one that's just got the 1-inch grid on. They're made of nice quality synthetic leather, and they also have a kill team mat as well if you wanted a smaller board. In any case, check them out, linked down in the video description if you wanted some battlefield supplies, and a big thank you to them for sponsoring this one. Next up, for the Adeptus Custodes, it's not too hard to go points intensive for these guys, though they did have quite a lot of their units only available in smaller numbers post their Codex. It seems that in their Codex now, the biggest and chunkiest unit that you can field are the Adeptus Custodian Terminators alongside a Shield Captain, as they're unable to be led by Trajan Valoris. If we included Forge World, a couple of things might have beaten them, including the really big jetpack squads that you can do, though I think it's the Orion dropship that takes the crown there. Adeptus Custodians are a solid unit in the Custodes army, perhaps more so in the lines of the Emperor detachment versus elsewhere. 4 wound toughness 7 Terminators, having a fair bit of volume fire with their Guardian Spears plus grenade launchers and the general purpose Custodian melee, mass attacks with strength 7, damage 2, hitting on a 2+, all buffed with martial Qatar, and maybe the lines of the Emperor plus 1 to wounds. They get 2 good datasheet rules, rerolling wound rolls against a bunch of tough targets, plus the nice ability to teleport them around the board. That could be extra nice if they split into smaller units with the relevant stratagem from the lines of the Emperor. Here we've got them joined by a Shield Captain. He's an extra 130 points. He's pretty fighty, can take various scary relics in the Lions detachment, and more Immortus is worth having somewhere in the army, then gives the unit some discounted stratagems, and can flex into a personal -1 to damage once per game. Overall, for power rating, I've given them a 6.5 out of 10. They are relevant in one of the strongest Custodian detachments. You would have a fairly fantastically threatening units that you could get into battle with rapid ingress or their teleport style rule. And perhaps uniquely out of all these big super units, you could immediately just have them break up and go their own way, with lots of individual Terminators teleporting around the board if it made sense to. In general, I'd say they're usable but not optimal. Most of the time when people use Allora's Terminators, it tends to be in smaller units, maybe going bigger investment for things like Wardens, where they're just extra tanky for the points cost. Next up, we've got the Adepta Sororitas, and for the sisters, we've got Morvenn Vahl leading a unit of Paragon Warsuits, all for 380 points. An enormous investment in a unit, but one that does seem to pay off as they're an absolutely terrifying threat on the board. The Paragon Warsuits are 210 points for 3 sisters and their sort of Nundan war mechs. They each get a multi-melter plus either Stormbolter or Grenade Launcher, and then the choice of 2 viable melee weapons. Their special rule gives them +1 to hit and wound against monsters and vehicles, so a round of firepower from their multi-melters can be utterly murderous, particularly with the odd miracle dice to help them hit harder. They are weighted more to damage versus defense though, even with toughness 7, 4 wounds and a 2+ save. Certain special weapon profiles can still kill them fairly quickly. They really want to be hitting something important before the other way around happens. Morvenn Vahl is basically auto-include to lead the first unit of them. She contributes a bunch of her own damage between missiles and Fidelis at range, and then the Lance of Illumination for a bunch of strength 8, damage 3 attacks with devastating wounds in melee. And if you sacrifice a miracle dice, she can go up to an extra +3 attacks. The way she really makes her unit extra scary though is to allow them to reroll all hits and wounds. So with already fairly reliable shooting coming out of the Paragon Warsuits, that takes them to the absolute next level. And if they ever get a full turn of activating it, then they can just ruin one unit with shooting and charge something else and demolish that too. Or that's rather nice when they can be both really strong in the Hallowed Martyrs detachment and the Champions of Faith. Hallowed Martyrs being rather excellent for directing the enemy melee where it doesn't want to go, and resurrecting Morvenn Vahl when she's slain, and the Champions of Faith having loads of support for Paragon Warsuits. Overall, they might be the biggest investment sisters unit, but they're also a fantastically competitive one as well. I gave them a 9 out of 10 for in-game power. For the Admech, it seems like the biggest unit is a slightly unusual looking one. You can take 4 Castellan robots in a unit, and then you can attach 3 Datasmiths if you want to, despite you only getting 1 in each box of 2 Castellan robots. Weirdly enough, it seems that you can attach as many Datasmiths as you want to, so the only thing that you're limited by is the rule of 3. It's perhaps a bit pointless though, besides having multiple enhancements within the same unit if you wanted to. Generally to make more sense just to include the 1. Castellan robots are a much enjoyed unit for the Adeptus Mechanicus. 9 wounds at toughness 7 with a 2+ save is at least relatively tanky, and they get their fun special rule where they get to reflect some mortal wounds at the enemy for high saves, weirdly occasionally bouncing damage back vastly far across the battlefield. They usually take to the field with either a Castellan Fist or Twin Fists, backed up by some firepower, often an Incendio and Combuster. You could swap one fist for a Phosphor Blaster shot if you wanted. They do have at least a fair bit of might, and they certainly enjoyed finally getting Doctrina Imperatives, but are a bit slow and ponderous to bring their might to bear with that 6-inch movement. Then for the Datasmith in the unit, they get to activate their protocols to allow them to either have +2 attacks to range or melee, or +1 toughness if that's going to make a difference versus enemy attacks, plus could bear some enhancements such as maybe the stealth one in the Raz Zone core. Overall they are usable enough, maybe tending to see a bit more play and success in more casual games versus the absolute top tables of competitive events. I've given them a 6.5 out of 10, maybe assuming that you were a little bit more sensible and just went with the 1 Datasmith as opposed to 3. I'd probably rate them a fair bit weaker if not though. For the Grey Knights, we've got another big chunky Terminator formation, and it seems that their highest investment unit is 10 Paladins plus Grandmaster Voldus at present. If you included their Forge World units, it'd be the Thunderhawk gunship. Paladins do have an interesting datasheet in Codex Grey Knights. Weirdly, they're no longer the tanky Terminators, but instead hit really quite hard on the charge. They each get 4 attacks hitting on a 2+, with Strength 6, AP -2, and Damage 3 on the charge, plus a fair bit of special weapon fire, a banner on the Ancient so they've got some fairly good OC, and the Narthesium now to allow you to return models to the unit. I feel like the Grey Knight Terminators are maybe a little pricey compared with the rest of the Codex. They might have a bit more luck in the Banishes detachment compared with some, being able to get lethal hits and threaten to pull such a valuable unit off the board when the enemy moves around nearby are both quite good advantages there. For Voldus himself, he makes them a little bit tougher to kill with a -1 to hit, a few mortal wounds in melee, and then at least a fairly punchy psychic range attack and some damage 3 attacks in close combat. He maybe isn't super standout versus the other Grey Knight characters though. I feel like I've seen lots more people running Librarians or Castellan Crow. Again, like the rest of these huge Terminator formations, they're not completely unusable, and if you do manage to bring all of their might to bear, then they're a pretty threatening prospect to have on the board, very efficient for buffs and stratagems, and they're going to be at least fairly hard to take down in return. In general though, I'd say the Paladins are just a touch on the pricey side for what they bring to the board, and Voldus isn't necessarily the first choice of character to lead them. I've given them a 5.5 out of 10 for in-game power. Again though, definitely a threat that you'd have to think very hard as to how you were going to manage them. For the Imperial Knights, despite being an entire faction of super heavies, from their core Codex units, their points costs aren't particularly standout on this big central unit list. The Knight Defender is now the single priciest one in the Codex at 425 points, and if you count their Forge World units, it'd instead be the Acacius Knights, the Asterius with the great big grav weapons being the single most expensive. The Knight Defender is the new Questoris Knight on the block. They all get 26 wounds at toughness 11, though as you might expect with its force field generator, the Defender's extra hard to kill with a 4+ invulnerable at range, and quite a powerful datasheet rule that if it's in the way of other knights when you shoot them, those knights gain the benefit of cover and also a 4+ invulnerable save too. Its bondsman ability is quite a nice one as well, -1 damage for a bonded armature, quite nice for a warglaive that you wanted to push out to the midboard and then hopefully not be quite so easy to kill. And its gun profiles are both big threatening ones, a whole bunch of anti-elite firepower from the Plasma Executor, and then general purpose conversion beam fire with the conversion beam obliterator, though a lot more effective if you can keep the target just over 18 inches away. Overall it's maybe early days for the Knight Codex yet, but it does look like these are being embraced by a fair few people on competitive lists. It seems like they are a consideration alongside Canis, Lancers, Atropos, and the other variants, though it seems that often when they're fielded they typically tend to be just one of them, perhaps given that you have diminishing returns after one copy of their shielding special rule. Overall though, feels like they're feeling at least fairly solid for in-game power so far. I've given them an 8 out of 10. For the Imperial Agents, we've got the Deathwatch Veterans and the Watchmaster. They're 285 points when they're fielded together, bringing some Space Marine Xenos might to the Inquisition. Deathwatch Veterans are one of the only efficient damage dealers for the Imperial Agents currently. We're sort of expecting to get a new datasheet in the not too distant future for them, but still for their current squad they've got really quite a threatening one, some nice close range shooting, plus some heavy thunderhammers in melee to hit really hard, and they could be one of the more efficient units to use in Imperialis fleet, potentially infiltrating to set up closer and using that rather nice reactive move stratagem. The Watchmaster's 95 points now, having dropped down from 105. He allows the Deathwatch veterans more threat range, allowing them to advance and shoot and charge or fall back, shoot and charge, plus discounted stratagems, and he does have some melee as well. Imperial Agents certainly struggling in general, but these guys were already a fairly strong unit for them, and they just got a little bit stronger in the last balance pass. I've given them a 7.5 out of 10. They're certainly one of the more notable units within the faction, though Imperial Agents in general are having problems, and I guess these rules might be rewritten to some extent when Games Workshop release the new Kill Team rules. Finally, for the Imperium, we've got the different Divergent chapter Space Marines. First up, there's the Blood Angels, and for the Divergent chapters, I thought we'd go for only counting their unique units for this one. It might be a little bit arbitrary, as they can use all the things from Codex Space Marines, but it means that a lot of those will basically just be big Terminator units once again. If we discount those, then it means that Sanguinary Guard plus Dante are the single priciest power combo units that the Blood Angels can field. Dante is the old veteran chapter master of the chapter, a fast-moving jump pack character who can hit hard on the charge, 8 attacks at strength 8 with lethal hits with the Axe Mortalis, potentially strength 10 and 9 attacks in Liberator. He gives +1 to advance and charge for his Sanguinary Guard units, so it does increase their threat range quite nicely, and also a +1 to hit in melee. Games Workshop did sort of mess with their synergy a bit in the latest rules update though. Sanguinary Guard got a touch more expensive to 260 points for a big unit, though they made them weapon skill 2+ and buffed the spears a bit. Unfortunately though, it did mean that Dante lost one of his best benefits for buffing a unit, so while they're still not bad together and certainly are a very hard hitting combo, there's a bit less argument for Dante specifically over say a jump captain now, also providing some hitting power and discounted stratagems. Sanguinary Guard themselves still hit really hard though, very nice general purpose profiles, plus fast moving and at least not too trivial to take down in combat given the -1 rules they have. If fielded together, this is still going to be a really hard hitting unit, and Dante can extend their charge threat range, which is no small thing. I've given them a 7 out of 10 for in-game power. I say it's still usable to fill them like this, but maybe a little bit less optimal than it was. For their battle brothers in the Angels of Death, the Dark Angels have a great big Terminator formation once again. It looks like if we limited them to their unique Dark Angels datasheets, it'd be Belial plus the Deathwing Terminators, given that you can't fill the Deathwing Knights in units of 10 anymore. That still clocks in at a pretty hefty amount, at 445 points. You could attach things like Ancients or Terminator Captains if you included generic units to this as well. The Dark Angels Deathwing Terminators are similar to the generic type, just costing very slightly more for a bonus ignores modifiers benefits, and the option to take a plasma cannon, which is all very fun and on theme, but not realistically very good I don't think. It could fry a few medium infantry, but I think I'd go with the Cyclone missile launcher for fairly similar sort of firepower, and not having the chance to fry a very expensive model. The Watcher in the Dark also adds a little bit more value as well, with its warding against mortal wounds once per game. Unfortunately, they still basically feel like a bit of a side grade versus the standard Space Marine Terminators, which have really cost too much for what they do on the board pretty much all edition. Then Grandmaster Belial is slightly frustrating in his niche abilities for such a cool model as well. Games Workshop basically made him a character hunting model, a captain style profile with precision, and allowing your unit to get some critical hits as precision ones as well, which is helpful in some matchups, though really not helpful at all in others. Overall, between all that, I've given them a 4.5 out of 10. They're still going to make a big impact, and they could have a big hit with rapid ingress perhaps, but I feel like both the Terminators and Belial aren't particularly strong choices for the Dark Angels, so going super heavy on them probably isn't going to be the best idea. Next up for the Black Templars and their mega unit is a Crusader squad combo, going for the big 20 strong battle brothers on the board, led by High Marshal Helbrecht himself, and he's backed up by the supporting character of a Crusade Ancient, all of that clocks in at 495 points. The Crusader squad are the battle line troops for the Templars. Unlike most Space Marine squads, they can be fielded in big squads of 20, though Games Workshop do charge a premium for that, and they clock in at 310 points. They're maybe a little bit lesser played that way versus Sword Brethren squads. They get their D6 plus 2-inch surge move, which makes them a liability to shoot if you've got anything nearby. Plus their enormous amount of chainsword attacks backed up by a few power fists are going to be at least fairly threatening and impactful against everything in the game, getting their permanent +1 to wound for things that are equal or higher toughness than their strength, or from their Templar vows. Then for the characters joining them, the Crusade Ancient probably isn't the best pick. I would have been more tempted to go for a Castellan, though he's a little more expensive. Even here though, he's still not completely useless. He does chip in a few more mastercrafted power weapon attacks, and the fights on death on a 4+ could genuinely be a big deal against certain melee armies. Far more useful and threatening though is High Marshal Helbrecht. He just has some pretty awesome melee threats with his big damage 3 attacks or sweeps. He gives the whole unit +1 strength and +1 attack, So each Primaris Crusader has 5 attacks at strength 5 and sustained hits 1 with +1 to wound against most things. That's pretty brutal on them, never mind the power fists and things. Can also punch the enemy early for a few mortal wounds at the start of the fight phase. Overall, it's an absolutely enormous investment, but genuinely a fairly tricky one for the opponent to handle in some situations. I've given the squad a 5.5 out of 10 for in-game power, or would have rated a bit higher if it was a Castellan perhaps, though lots of Black Templar lists seem to be going more for the Sword Brethren combos these days. Next up, we've got the Space Wolves, and for them we've got Terminators once again. This time it's the Chapter Master Logan Grimnar leading a big squad of 10 of the Wolfguard Terminators. That all clocks in at 450 points. The Wolfguard Terminators just feel like fairly flatly improved standard Terminators to me. They get a whole bunch of relic power weapon attacks, an extra wound from Storm Shields, plus a Great Axe on the Sergeant, and a data sheet rule of -1 to wound built in. Just overall means that they're just a bit tougher and a bit more threatening than most Terminators. I quite enjoy the Saga of the Beast Slayer for some lethal hits, or Gladius potentially. Logan Grimnar is also a very powerful model, 110 points, so only a tiny bit more expensive than Ayak now. He contributes some good damage 3 melee to the fight, some anti-horde with Tyrneck and Fenrir, and then 2 really quite powerful datasheet rules. The command point debuff one within 12 inches is pretty excellent to have in the midboard, and a massive Terminator squad would help him keep it there. Plus he allows his units to deep strike turn 1, and that could be a really big deal for making sure such a big scary unit actually makes it to the fight in a reasonable amount of time and can't just be ignored for a turn or 2. Overall, both the Terminators and Logan are rather good. I think I will be more tempted by seeing the Terminators in a squad of 5 than 10. I've still given them a 7 out of 10 overall though. They perhaps make a little bit more sense in a list compared with some of the Terminator big blocks we've seen so far. Finally for the Imperium and one more squad of Terminators, we've got the Deathwatch. They've got some various kill team combos. So with their base data sheet, it is the Terminators that have the highest cost once again. They go up to 350 points, and again could be a bit higher if you allowed some generic Terminator characters to join them. For the 350 points, you get an interesting enough Terminator squad. You get 3 heavy weapons in the unit, and the rest could take Thunderhammer and Storm Shield for some extra survivability. So you'd wind up with a fair bit more toughness than most. They then get the kill team keyword, which could be really quite efficient, alongside some of the Black Spear Task Force stratagems, allowing some special issue ammo on multiple squads, or easy access to teleporting them around the table. I certainly rate the Deathwatch Terminators as a solid unit for the faction. They were in most competitive lists prior to the balance update, but maybe lost a bit of ground versus the other kill teams that went down in cost since. I feel like they're really a unit that you want to field in squads of 5 though, to have the emphasis on the shooting. I've given them a 5.5 out of 10 for this bigger squad. If they're in squads of 5, I'd probably rate them something like a 7.5 or 8. Let's go through the Force of Chaos next, and perhaps for a break from power armor, let's start with the Daemons, with their single biggest, scariest and most points intensive unit being Shalaxi Hellbane, clocking in at 380 points, so just 5 points more than Be'lakor. Shalaxi is Slaanesh's great Huntmaster demon, well capable of hunting down the greater demons of the rival deities. For the 380 points, you get a 20 wound greater demon, moving fast with a 14-inch movement, having some range damage with the Pavane of Slaanesh, and a good mix of threatening melee attacks with a bunch at strength 12 and damage d6 plus 2, and the extra snapping claw ones with strength 6 and damage 3. For special rules, you get to reroll advanced and charge rolls, though Shalaxi had really quite a big nerf in the Demons update, swapping out the massive buffs against characters, monsters and vehicles for one of the Quarry style special rules, which is really quite a lot less powerful, as the opponent might just be able to keep that one nominated unit away from you, so you don't get the damage buffs. As a result, Shalaxi has wound up as one of the single lesser played greater demons. Most of the others are considered really quite strong, though I feel like despite the points cut, it could still do with going down further. Overall, I've given a 6 out of 10 for in-game power. Not useless, but is still rated as one of the single most overshadowed greater demons, and probably could have done with dropping some points alongside the Keeper of Secrets in the last update. For the Spiky Knights, it's their Dominus class Knight Tyrant that gets the win here. 410 points for a great big heretical fortress of guns. If you included the Forge World Knights once again, it would be the Acaster's Asterius. The Knight Tyrant can be fielded either as the Castellan or Valiant pattern depending on the weapons. You have a slower knight than usual, but also a slightly tougher one, with toughness 12 and 28 wounds rather than the toughness 11 and 26 of the Abhorrent and the Questoris class, and then most choose to go with the Castellan pattern, Ectoplasma Decimator and the Brimstone Volcano Lance, so you have one just absolutely enormous anti-tank weapon at strength 20, AP 5 and damage d6 plus 8, plus the Ectoplasma Cannon that's just very general purpose. They're very strong against heavy infantry. The Tyrant class Knights aren't so much more expensive than the other Chaos Knight patterns now, so you can get really quite a lot of stats for the points cost, and it can work quite well with any big single focal things like stratagems such as Diabolic Bulwark, or would enjoy the buffs from sustained hits from the Infernal Lance perhaps, and the massive full reroll stratagem that you can get from the Lords of Dread. It's quite nice to see these not quite so far behind as they might have been in the past. I've given them a 7.5 out of 10 for in-game power. Next up for the World Eaters, their Squadron Leader combos are very narrowly beaten out by the Lord of Skulls. 505 points for a towering demon engine of Khorne, propelled forward on great big tracks and powered by some vast tanks of blood at the back. He's only kind of narrowly ahead of Lord Invocator's plus 20 Khorne Berserkers though. In game he certainly brings a fairly enormous amount of stats to the table. 24 wounds at toughness 13, so is extra resilient against things like las cannons having to wound him on a 5+, and then big damage both at range and in melee. 2 big hitting shooting profiles, and then some fairly enormous melee stats. The Great Cleaver of Khorne gets 6 attacks at strength 16, AP -4 and damage 8, and the World Eaters have got plenty of good ways to buff that. It gets the new Night style rule for smashing through big bits of terrain, and you also get an extra d6 to roll towards your blessings, which certainly doesn't hurt too much. Currently in the World Eaters it doesn't feel unusable but does feel a bit overshadowed. It definitely will do a lot of damage, but for over 500 points it absolutely has to. With quite a lot of its value being melee related, it's got a bit of potential to be getting screened by things. Overall, I'd certainly not say it's unusable, but it just feels like for the points cost, the amount of World Eaters units that you could get in place of this, things like 8-bound in particular now for damage dealers, you might potentially be doing a bit better with investing it in other things. Overall, I've given it a 5.5 out of 10 for in-game power. Next up for the Core Chaos Space Marines, we've got Abaddon the Despoiler and his retinue of Terminators. As we've already seen, Terminators often tend to be towards the top of how much you can pay for models in Warhammer 40k points-wise, and Abaddon the Despoiler being sort of near Primarch levels of points cost can add to that, and as a result it seems that we've got the biggest and most points-intensive Terminator combo out of this whole video. The Chaos Terminators are relatively similar points costs and weapon profiles to the Loyalists. They do have the annoying thing where they have individual weapons being locked to the set bits of kit on their models. They could deep strike into combat and potentially get their way into melee with rapid ingress, and then compared with their Loyalist brothers they'll be hitting extra hard when they get there, Dark Pacts amping up their damage output and then allowing them to reroll hit rolls as well. I'd say they're usable for the Chaos Space Marines, though not standout, often getting passed over for competitive lists compared with things like Possessed or Chosen for melee rush. Then added to them we've got Abaddon the Despoiler, an enormous 270 point model that has a whole bunch of threat in his own right, 8 attacks with devastating wounds at strength 14 and damage 3 is no slouch in close combat. He has the chance to rustle up a few extra command points if you do Dark Pacts with him, which I'm sure he will be when he makes melee, and then has a lot of value with his 3 powerful aura abilities, allowing things around him to reroll the hit roll, giving things invulnerable saves, or helping out with leadership and battle shock. It is kind of unfortunate that he has quite such a big anti-synergy with the Chaos Terminators though. I'd argue the best of his 3 aura buffs is the reroll hit, which is a massive asset to the army, perhaps particularly in Pact Bound where you might be able to fish for lethal or sustained hits on 5s, but that just directly overlaps with the Terminator's datasheet rule which allows them to reroll all hit rolls just for doing Dark Pacts anyway. As a result, if you're going to get Abaddon a retinue, you're probably far better off with him leading Chosen, who are both quite a lot cheaper and value those hit rerolls far more. Due to that, I've given them a 5.5 out of 10. They'll certainly hit hard, but given the enormous points cost, aren't really all that tough for that cost. Even with the Terminator stat lines, 630 points came by a lot of other units. It feels like Abaddon is going to be better with Chosen, maybe buffing some ranged units in the early game before making its way to melee. Next up, we've got the Emperor's Children. I believe at Codex release it would have been Fulgrim with the single most expensive. Now it's Lucius and the Flawless Blades. Technically you could say it's Shalaxi Hellbane again, given that you can field her in the Demonic Allies detachment, though given that that's detachment locked I thought would go with the ones that you can field anywhere. Flawless Blades got a solid damage buff recently. They're the Slaneshi elites that aren't possessed but get mutations to amp up their already great skills. Have 4 attacks that hit on a 2 with strength 6, AP 3 and damage 2, and have the unusually scary special rule that mean that you can auto wound anything in the game on a 3+, but if you do fail to destroy anything, then you lose a model. It means that even a squad of 3 of them for 110 points is really quite threatening against basically everything, and a squad of 6 should be threatening to end most normal sized threats in the game in a single round of combat. Lucius the Eternal can either lead them or act as a lone operative. He's got good damage, defense and speed, and he can make use of the datasheet rule for the Flawless Blades. He's got solid damage that wounding everything on a 3+ would help with. He's barely going to be putting a blade stroke wrong, given his personal datasheet rerolls to reroll everything against characters, monsters and walkers. You do make one incredibly scary damage dealing super unit by putting them together, though it does mean that you lose some things as well. Lucius loses his fights first and the utility that you get from being a lone operative, and while it does add to the critical mass of melee for the squad, I can't help but think that quite a lot of the time you might just be better off with 6 Flawless Blades and Lucius going his own way, perhaps being a bit stronger if they were apart versus together. They're certainly fast and very dangerous and could annihilate one of the enemy's biggest and scariest units in a single round of combat though, I've given them a 6.5 out of 10 for in-game power. Then for Nurgle's Legion, we've got the Blightlord Terminators. A big squad of 10 of those, led by a Lord of Contagion, takes the crown here, and their big Terminator combo clocks in at 505 points. The Blightlords are slightly tougher than normal Chaos Terminators, 3 wounds at toughness 7, and compared with the Death Shroud, they're the more general purpose ones, having some range threat with their different heavy weapons within the unit, getting +1 strength and AP when targeting afflicted units, and still having some fairly nice general purpose melee with their bubotic blades with damage 2 and lethal hits. Their profile's really not too bad, but they have been struggling to get a look in versus the Death Shroud with their crazy 6-inch deep strike charge that they can do. It's just been kind of rare to see them in competitive lists as a result compared with the Death Shroud. The Lord of Contagion feels just a little bit mismatched on this unit. It's still certainly not bad though, and the squad will still have an absolute ton of fairly high quality melee. Already doing lots of lethal hits, he'll also give them Lance for +1 to wound, which is great on strength 5, and sustained hits 1 as well. His own personal damage profile will also help in a big way against tough stuff, and he can take good enhancements as well, including 2 good damage dealer ones from Virulent Vectorium. Overall, there's still massive might within the unit. They should be able to demolish whatever they can get a charge on, they just won't be able to catch it quite as easily as the Death Guard with their really short charges. There needs 2 rapid ingress, which could delay how fast they get into the enemy, or risk doing a 9-inch charge, or just being kited with their slow movement characteristic. Overall, I've given them a 5.5 out of 10. It just feels like the Lord of Contagion is so much better with the Death Shroud at the moment, given how they can get him into melee and hit hard when they get there. Finally, for the Forces of Chaos, we've got the Thousand Sons, and for their big phalanx of Terminators, we've got the Astra Cult. It seems that 10 of them with a Terminator Sorcerer attached just beats out Magnus by 10 points. Though there's less in it than there was before, given that Magnus went up a bit and the Terminator squads went down. If you're taking Scarab Cult Terminators, the Terminator Sorcerer is generally a good idea. It's not the most expensive at 85 points and amps up their damage in 2 different ways. Lethal hits is great for all of their profiles at range and melee, and they recently changed his Mark by Fate rules so that rather than buffing the other units in your army, he now buffs the squad zone shooting, marking 1 unit, and then basically your entire squad will be hitting on a 2+ against that unit this phase. He also chips into magical firepower with an anti-monster and anti-vehicle psyche attack, an Inferno Combi Bolter, and does have some hits in melee as well. Then for his Dusty Terminator charges, they have 10 fairly sturdy models with a Terminator stat line with the -1 to wound special rule, loads of pretty scary volume fire, all hitting at AP -2 with the Combi Bolters, plus a couple of heavy weapons within the unit, and they can all get further buffs from Kabbalistic Rituals as well. Overall, they're definitely one of the Terminator combos that makes more sense out there. They've been rather overshadowed for Thousand Sons so far. They've given some big nerfs to everything else and some buffs to these. I really wouldn't be too surprised if a few more people take some big damage combos. At least a few people seem to like them for competitive lists before. Overall, I've given them a 7 out of 10, probably a bit stronger in Rubrique Phalanx where they've got lots of stratagem support versus elsewhere. Moving on to Xenos next, and first up we have the Aeldari, and their big chunky power unit is the Mighty Wraith Knight, a super heavy construct to absolutely tower over the others. It certainly makes this Guardian look small here. If we counted Forge World, it'd be the Phantom Titan, who can loom over this guy. In game, the Wraith Knight is 435 points for the gun version. They did finally separate the melee versus ranged one in the Codex. After that, you get 18 wounds at toughness 12. If you sacrifice one of the guns for a scatter shield, then it's -1 damage to enemy attacks as well, but that is quite a big deal, cutting your damage in half basically. For its firepower, you can go with a more general purpose Sun Cannon, though the heavy Wraith Cannons are kind of hard to pass up. D3 shots each at strength 20, AP -4, and 2d6 damage with devastating wounds. Certainly well capable of one-rounding enemy battle tanks with a couple of those on the go. Overall though, 435 points. It just doesn't realistically do enough damage or defense to outweigh taking other Aeldari units, particularly all the Aspect Warriors that can jump from behind terrain from a mile away, do lots of damage, and then have sneaky tricks to remain safe. There are also very few synergies that the Wraith Knight can access in the Codex. The vast majority of useful ones that you'd actually want to put on it tend to be locked out and exclude Titanic units. Between that, I've seen very few people putting Wraith Knights on the table recently. They just don't generally tend to be the way to go for Aeldari. I've given this one a 4.5 out of 10 for in-game power. Next up, we've got the Drukhari. Their Codex is coming out fairly shortly at the weekend, though at the moment without official points cost for it yet. I'm going to remain going by the index, and that means that the single biggest and most points intensive unit, I believe, is the combo between the Archon, Court of the Archon, and the Kabbalite Warriors that you can all join together as one enormous unit. The Kabbalite Warriors provide the backbone for the unit. Fast moving and plenty of special weapons within the squad. They give sticky objectives to the unit as well, which could genuinely be pretty impactful if they move on to the mid-board objectives to take one. The Archon allows the Court unit to join, which gives them a whole bunch of interesting buffs. The Slith gives them -1 to wound, which can make them a fair bit tougher. They have fights first from the Urgle. and lethal hits from the layman, and between all those and some fancy melee profiles from the models themselves, you have really quite a hard-hitting unit that's at least a bit harder to kill than average Drukhari. Then you have the Archon themselves to lead the squad, who's pretty great as a data sheet in himself, some good quality anti-infantry attacks, a shadow field to make him super unreliable to kill even after you've wiped out his squad. He makes pain tokens incredibly efficient, allowing them to basically give you reroll all hits and wounds for the unit, and also debuffs enemy stratagems and command points, so it's pretty excellent to have in a position where he's moving forward and playing aggressively. Overall, between all that, you can get a pretty terrifying unit. You can get enhancements for the Archon to allow them to deep strike or other things. Definitely solid enough to be competitive. I've given them an 8 out of 10 for some in-game power. Sadly, with the core of the Archon being retired to Legends very shortly, it'll be something else taking over from this as the most points-intensive unit for the new Drukhari. Maybe Lady Malice and Incubi will be the ones. Next up, we've got the Tyranids, and I believe that there's 2 tied for this one, the Swarm Lord and a maxed out squad of Tyrant Guard, or Old One Eye joined by 2 Carnifexes. Again, if you count Forge World, it'd be the Biotitan Hierophants. Both being equal, I could have picked either. I went for Swarm Lord and Tyrant Guard this one, rather than Carnifex Monster Mash. The Swarm Lord's a model that was kind of underwhelming for a fair bit of 10th edition, though given some recent points cuts, he seems to have come right back in fashion. 220 points for a big scary Hive Tyrant. He does have an anti-infantry sort of shooting attack with the Synaptic Pulse, plus some okay twin-linked melee that could countercharge a bit against some medium infantry or vehicles. Perhaps the main thing that he's bringing to the table is a whole bunch of command point shenanigans. He generates a command point each turn, so excellent for any detachment that really wants to go heavy on their stratagems. He has one of the command point debuff rules, so if he can be in at least a somewhat threatening ruin staged out of line of sight, then he can make himself a problem for the opponent, and also helps out with Synapse range too. He's more typically seen on his own than with Tyrant Guard, though despite being lesser played I do think they're kind of interesting still. They're just fantastically tanky for the points cost. 80 points for 3 models at toughness 8, 4 wounds and a 3+ save is just not efficient for virtually anything in Warhammer 40k to chew through, and it does mean that the Swarm Lord could play a bit more aggressively, and more safely make use of his melee profile or command point debuff without feeling too bad about some of these getting downs to enemy fire. They will chip in a bit of their own damage as well, perhaps with some Twin Links Crushing Claws. And if they were going to go anywhere, it probably makes more sense on the Swarm Lord. There could be an interesting Synapse unit for the Synaptic Nexus, or potentially quite valuable models to regenerate in Assimilation Swarm. Overall, I've given the big unit when combined a 7 out of 10, or would likely rate the Swarm Lord a little higher if he was not with these guys though. It's just slightly more efficient overall to keep him cheaper and use terrain to keep him safe and just play him a bit more conservatively in the army as opposed to paying for quite a pricey bodyguard. Next up for their cultist allies we have the Genestealer Cults, and for their big unit we've got 10 Aberrants and an Abominant. Some nice sort of Frankenstein monster freaks, all ready to tear apart the enemy's heavies with their big punchy power tools. For the Aberrants, for quite small models, they have perhaps deceptively good toughness. Each one has 3 wounds at toughness 6 with a 5+ feel no pain, and then they're also -1 to wound as well, provided there's a character in the squad, so usually there will be. They've got quite nice general purpose melee attacks, at a bunch of strength 7, AP -2 and damage 2 ones, a profile that can take buffs rather well. Then if they're joined by an Abominant, he's an 85-point character. He helps out the unit in quite a big way against tough stuff, 4 attacks at strength 12 and damage d6+1. He gives them fights on death, which is definitely relevant against certain melee foes, and then has his fun special rule to basically stand up on death when he dies, and he does so at 4 wounds remaining, and that means that per point is actually genuinely pretty tanky. On average, with his feel no pain and the regeneration, you have to take down around about 14 wounds worth of toughness 6 character here to bring him down fully. Kind of unusually good on the durability front there. Perhaps the most painful thing is the big squad of Aberrants paying really quite a big premium versus the smaller 5-man squad, which is 135 points. It means that lots of lists tend to go for the smaller squad versus the bigger. They're far more efficient in Biosantic Brood Surge, where they get some nice melee buffs built in, plus dedicated support to them. Though if you do go for a big squad, I suppose could be an interesting enough one for the Infiltrate enhancement to put a big tough and threatening unit in the midfield right from the word go. Overall, I'd be a bit more tempted by smaller squads of them. I've given them a sort of middling 6 out of 10 here. I would rate them a little bit stronger than this if the Aberrants were in smaller 5-man squads, and particularly so if in Biosantic Brood Surge. Next up for the Orcs, nothing really comes close to the Stomper at 800 points. A big and striking effigy to Gork, armed with some massive firepower, a great big chainsword, and all sorts of Gretchen running up and down it, banging it with hammers. Stompers do seem to be in the sort of size and power of model where Games Workshop just don't really want to make them anything approaching good, and 800 points is a lot for what it does. There's nothing necessarily wrong with its stat line, just more its points cost. It has 30 wounds at a big toughness 14 and a 2+ save, then lots of shots with a big def cannon and super gatler, And the Mega Chopper profile is a pretty fun one. 6 attacks at strength 24, AP 5, and a huge damage 10, or a sweep mode. The numbers that it can put out in terms of firepower do get kind of okay in Dread Mob. You can give it a mech to have it hitting on +1 to hit, and then stack the detachment rule and stratagems for some actually fairly seriously scary threats. If you're playing on a board where you know it's going to be able to get some targets and is going to be able to move between the terrain pieces okay, then it is actually kind of playable there. Elsewhere, just kind of hideously overcosted. I've given it a 3.5 out of 10 between those. For the Tau Empire, again we've got a Titanic model in the Storm Surge. The Storm Surge is 400 points to put on the table, and often seems to be referred to as a walking battleship for the Tau. A big profile with some recoil stabilising legs, and then covered in guns between its enormous primary weapon, some destroyer missiles, and banks of missile pods. There are other things that are more points intensive than this guy. For the bigger Tau stuff though, if you're counting Forge World, it would be the Manta, and in most codexes before 10th edition it would have been the Tau Crisis suits, though now you can only field them in 3s. For your 400 points, the Storm Surge has 20 wounds at toughness 11 with a 2+ save and a 4+ invulnerable. For the points cost, its defense isn't really too bad, and it is going to be legitimately threatening against any sort of big tank or vehicle that it can get range and line of sight on. That Pulse Blast Cannon gets 2 shots at strength 24, AP 6, and a crazy damage 12. It's just very swingy depending on whether or not you miss a hit or wound roll, or if the opponent's got some sort of invulnerable save, which they're almost certainly going to command point reroll if they do. Then it backs it up with its missile pods, destroyer rockets, and secondary weapon systems, and they're quite a bit more effective now there's no penalty for splitting fire. It ignores all modifiers to the hit roll, and if it can ever remain static, then you get the heavy keyword, so you're going to be hitting on a 3+ or 2+ if guided. Between all that, I feel like the Storm Surge isn't really all that far away from being a fairly solid unit. Again, it's the points cost that's just a bit high for what it does. It did improve a bit with a change to the For the Greater Good special rule, but it still seems to be in the position where for most people, it's just not really worth its points cost in other units that you might take. I've given it a 5.5 out of 10. For the Leagues of Votann, it's kind of the Votann Terminator equivalents in the Einherjar Hearthguard that take the top spot. 365 points when they're led by Uthar the Destined, who's a little bit more expensive than a Karl. These guys have perhaps been a little bit de-emphasised in the Codex. Now they've got a bunch more damage dealer infantry to compete with. They still have some interest. They're 270 points for a squad of 10 of them, now often being armed with their rapid-fire Etakarn plasma guns for a bunch of strength 7 and damage 2 attacks that can take other buffs well. A whole bunch of blast attacks to help thin out hordes. They can reroll some hit rolls against the closest targets, and still have an okay threat in melee between all their concussion gauntlets, at least with a massed up squad. If they take a teleport crest, they can deep strike into battle. To max out the unit here, they'd be paired with Uthar the Destined. He's the one that gives you some discounted stratagems and has some okay damage and defense of his own. More typically though, he tends to be loitering in the home field, perhaps with some Hearthkin as a guard, and handing out free stratagems to other units. I've seen a few people using big squads of Einherjar Hearthguard in the Needguard Oathband with the Oathband Speculator enhancement, and that gives you some lethal hits, reroll 1s to wound, and a +1 to wound if you sacrifice a bunch of judgment tokens, between all that making the plasma guns pretty vicious even against tough stuff. For the squad with Uthar, I just feel like they don't really quite have the damage output, even if they do have discounted stratagems, and as a result I've given them a 5 out of 10 for in-game power. If they were with a Karl or even an Einherjar champion, I'd rank a bit higher, and particularly so in Needguard. Finally, and for our last super heavy unit, we've got the Necrons Tesseract Vault. This one's the dual build with the Obelisk, having a trapped Transcendent Catan at the centre of it, hovering forward and zapping people with those Tesla spheres, and then unleashing some otherworldly powers of the Catan. To field this one in game, it's 425 points. It's got a pretty sturdy defensive stat line. Toughness 12 with 24 wounds and a 4+ invulnerable save is rather nice, particularly with living metal, and maybe more so if there's either a spider or a Canoptek reanimator anywhere nearby. It's going to take a lot of focus efforts to take this thing down. The Tesla spheres have some genuinely good anti-infantry firepower with a bunch of sustained hits to attacks. They'll certainly reliably stack saves on literally everything. And then for the main attacks, it's likely to be Antimatter Meteor for a bunch of strength 10 and damage 3 shots, plus Cosmic Fire for a punchy torrent shot, maybe swapping out for Time's Arrow if there happens to be a relevant enemy character that you might be able to snipe. Its big profile might give it a lot of issues when moving around the board, so it's likely to be quite a lot more usable in Hypercrypt with the ability to return to reserves or deep strike with cosmic precision, and that's got a few other good support stratagems for super heavies. Overall I've given it a 6.5 out of 10, I'd rate it far stronger in Hypercrypt versus elsewhere though. In any case, that's just about it for this one. Let me know your thoughts on these big investment units in Warhammer 40k. Have you had any luck with some stacked up Terminator combos, or some of the biggest super heavies from their codexes? I look forward to hearing all your thoughts down in the comments below. As mentioned, thanks to Ligher Creative for sponsoring this video. You can check them out, links down in the video description. If you'd like to take a look over their terrain set and their battle mat, both of them feel to me like quite a good balance between an alright price and solid enough quality. If you are looking for a 40k terrain set or a gaming surface, I'll leave that there for now though. Feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more like this. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming with new ones just about every day. If you'd like to support the channel and keep these videos coming, Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description down below. Channel patrons get a few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link's down in the video description below. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.